January 12, 1928. 11:06 p.m. Sing Sing Prison, New York. In the suffocating silence of the death chamber, Ruth Snyder takes her final breath. The leather straps bite into her wrists. The electrodes press cold against her shaved skull. 2,000 volts course through her body as America watches through the lens of a hidden camera, smuggled into history's most forbidden moment. But this isn't just the story of an execution. This is the story of how one photograph would expose the dark hunger of a nation obsessed with death, and how a Queen's housewife became the most hated woman in America. The flash that captured Ruth Snyder's final seconds didn't just illuminate her death. It revealed something sinister about the American soul. That grainy, haunting image would sell over 1 million newspapers in a single day, making it the most infamous crime photograph ever taken. The New York Daily News would plaster it across their front page with the chilling headline, "Dead." For the first time in American history, the public could witness an execution without setting foot in the death house. They could stare into the face of justice, of vengeance, of a woman who had orchestrated the brutal murder of her own husband for love and money. But what they saw in that photograph wasn't just Ruth Snyder dying. It was themselves, hungry for blood, desperate to witness the ultimate punishment. Who was this woman whose death became America's entertainment? What drove a mother, a wife, a seemingly ordinary suburban woman to commit such a heinous crime that even hardened criminals turned away in disgust? The answer lies not in the electric chair, but in the tangled web of passion, greed, and deception that Ruth Snyder wove through the jazz-soaked streets of 1920s New York. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. This is the story of Ruth Snyder and Henry Judd Gray, two lovers whose affair would end in murder, whose trial would captivate a nation, and whose execution would be captured in the most controversial photograph in American criminal history. It's a tale that begins not with violence, but with the quiet desperation of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, dreaming of freedom she would never live to enjoy. The camera that captured Ruth Snyder's death was strapped to the ankle of Chicago Tribune reporter Tom Howard, hidden beneath his trouser leg. He had traveled hundreds of miles for this single shot, this moment that would define crime photography forever. As the switch was thrown and electricity surged through Ruth's body, Howard's finger found the shutter release. The flash illuminated not just a woman's death, but America's darkest fascination. But to understand how Ruth Snyder ended up in that chair, we must travel back 2 years earlier, to a modest home in Queens Village, where a bored housewife was about to meet the man who would change everything. Queens Village, 1926. A neighborhood of modest homes and manicured lawns, where respectability was measured by the straightness of your hedge and the shine of your automobile. Ruth Brown Snyder lived at 9327 222nd Street in a 2-story house that looked exactly like every other house on the block, except for the secrets festering behind its lace curtains. At 32, Ruth possessed the kind of platinum blonde beauty that turned heads on subway platforms and made married men linger too long at soda fountains. Her steel blue eyes held a restless hunger that her neighbors mistook for sophistication. She dressed impeccably, spoke with practiced refinement, and played the role of devoted wife and mother with Academy Award precision. But beneath the carefully constructed facade, Ruth Snyder was suffocating. Her husband, Albert Snyder, was everything 1920s society deemed admirable in a husband: steady, successful, predictable. 13 years her senior, Albert worked as an art editor for Motor Boating magazine, earning enough to provide Ruth with the suburban comfort she'd never known growing up poor in the Bronx. He was dependable as clockwork, home every evening at 6:15, dinner at 7 o'clock, bed by 10:30. Albert's greatest passion wasn't his wife. It was his dead former fiancée, Jessie Gischard, whose photograph he kept prominently displayed on their bedroom dresser. Ruth had learned to hate that photograph almost as much as she'd grown to despise the man who worshipped it. Albert spoke of Jessie constantly, her beauty, her virtue, her tragic death from typhoid fever just months before their planned wedding. In Albert's eyes, Ruth would always be second choice, a poor substitute for the perfect woman he'd lost. The message was clear. Jessie was the love of his life. Ruth was merely the woman who happened to be alive. Their marriage had produced one bright spot: 9-year-old Lorraine, a precocious child who inherited her mother's striking features and her father's stubborn streak. Ruth adored her daughter, but even motherhood couldn't fill the growing void in her chest. She spent her days shopping, gossiping with neighbors, and attending matinee performances at local theaters, anything to escape the suffocating routine of suburban domesticity. The 1920s promised liberation for American women: shorter skirts, cigarettes, independence. Ruth watched from her kitchen window as the world transformed around her, but she remained trapped in a prison of respectability, bound by wedding vows to a man who treated her like an unwelcome tenant in her own home. She began staying out later, taking mysterious phone calls, and developing friendships Albert knew nothing about. Albert Snyder was not a cruel man, but he was an indifferent one. He provided for Ruth materially while starving her emotionally, never understanding that his wife's growing restlessness was a warning sign of the storm approaching their carefully ordered lives. He saw her new dresses, her frequent shopping trips, her subtle rebellion against his authority, but dismissed these changes as typical female behavior, frivolous and ultimately harmless. Ruth began frequenting Manhattan speakeasies, where jazz music drowned out the sound of her mounting desperation, and illegal gin numbed the ache of her loneliness. She told Albert she was visiting her mother or shopping with girlfriends. In reality, she was searching for something or someone to rescue her from the suffocating predictability of her existence. The answer would come in the form of a traveling corset salesman with sad eyes and gentle hands, a man as trapped in his own life as Ruth was in hers. Their meeting would seem like fate, their affair like salvation. Neither could imagine it would lead them both to the electric chair. June 1925. Henry's Restaurant, Manhattan. The clatter of dishes and hum of conversation created the perfect backdrop for chance encounters and stolen moments. Ruth Snyder sat at a corner table, nursing a gin Ricky and watching the evening crowd filter in from the sweltering summer streets. She was supposed to be shopping for Lorraine's school clothes, but the pull of the city's anonymous energy had drawn her here instead, to this dimly lit sanctuary where married women could pretend to be someone else. Henry Judd Gray noticed her immediately. At 38, he possessed the kind of unremarkable handsomeness that women found comforting rather than threatening. His soft brown eyes held a perpetual sadness that spoke of disappointment and compromise. Gray was a successful corset salesman for the Bien Jolie Company, traveling the eastern seaboard with sample cases full of feminine undergarments, an irony not lost on a man whose own life felt increasingly constricted. Like Ruth, Henry was married to Isabel, a frail woman who treated their union like a business arrangement rather than a romance. Their marriage had produced a daughter, Jane, now 14, but little else beyond polite conversation and shared meals. Henry spent most of his time on the road, selling intimate apparel to women he would never touch, returning home to a wife who barely acknowledged his existence. When Henry approached Ruth's table that humid evening, neither expected the electric connection that sparked between them. He asked if he might buy her a drink. She accepted with a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to devastatingly beautiful. They talked for hours, about books, about dreams deferred, about the suffocating weight of expectations. Henry found himself drawn to Ruth's restless energy, her refusal to accept the limitations others placed on her. Ruth discovered in Henry a kindred spirit, another soul trapped in the amber of middle-class respectability. Their affair began with stolen afternoons in Manhattan hotel rooms, clandestine meetings disguised as shopping trips and business appointments. Henry would register under false names: Mr. and Mrs. Klein, Mr. and Mrs. Gray, whatever felt safest in the moment. Ruth would arrive separately, her heart pounding with the thrill of transgression and the intoxicating rush of being desired. In Henry's arms, Ruth found the passion Albert had never offered. Henry listened when she spoke, laughed at her jokes, made her feel like the center of the universe rather than an afterthought. He bought her expensive gifts, jewelry, perfume, silk stockings, tokens of an affection she'd never experienced in her own home. For the first time since her marriage, Ruth felt truly alive. But their relationship was more than physical attraction. Both Ruth and Henry were dreamers trapped in practical lives, romantics suffocating in marriages built on convenience rather than love. They fantasized about a future together, about escaping their respective prisons and starting over somewhere far from Queens and the suffocating expectations of their current lives. The problem, of course, was Albert and Isabel, two spouses who stood between the lovers and their imagined paradise. Initially, Ruth and Henry spoke only of divorce, difficult and expensive in 1920s America, but not impossible. Ruth began dropping hints to Albert about their marriage's problems, testing the waters for a potential separation. But Albert dismissed her complaints as feminine hysteria, never taking seriously the depth of his wife's unhappiness. As the months passed, their conversations grew darker. What if Albert simply wasn't there anymore? What if some accident befell him, freeing Ruth to live her life as she chose? Henry, initially horrified by such suggestions, found himself gradually warming to the idea. After all, Albert Snyder was a cold, unfeeling man who made Ruth miserable. Wouldn't the world be better without him? The seed was planted. Now it only needed the right conditions to grow into something monstrous. By late 1926, Ruth Snyder had transformed from desperate housewife to calculating predator. The woman who once merely dreamed of escape now plotted murder with the methodical precision of an accountant balancing ledgers. But Ruth's plans weren't driven by passion alone. They were fueled by cold, hard mathematics. Albert Snyder was worth more dead than alive, a fact Ruth discovered while rifling through his personal papers during one of his weekend fishing trips. Her husband, ever the prudent businessman, had accumulated a substantial portfolio of life insurance policies over the years. The largest, a $48,000 policy from Prudential Life Insurance, contained a double indemnity clause that would pay $96,000 in the event of accidental death, nearly $1.5 million in today's currency. Ruth's mind raced as she studied the documents. $96,000 would buy her freedom, luxury, and most importantly, a life with Henry Gray far from the suffocating confines of Queens Village. She could travel to Europe, live in Manhattan penthouses, give Lorraine every advantage money could buy. All she needed was for Albert to die under the right circumstances. The insurance policies became Ruth's obsession. She memorized every clause, every condition, every loophole that might increase the payout. She learned that accidental death would yield the maximum benefit, while murder, if discovered, would void the policies entirely. The challenge was clear. Albert's death had to appear completely accidental, with no trace of foul play to alert suspicious investigators. Ruth began her campaign of attempted murder with amateur enthusiasm and professional incompetence. Her first attempt came during a family vacation to the Adirondacks in August 1926. While Albert napped in their cabin, Ruth disconnected the gas line to their heating stove, hoping carbon monoxide would quietly claim his life. But Albert awoke with a headache and opened the windows for fresh air, unwittingly saving his own life while attributing his discomfort to the mountain altitude. Undeterred, Ruth tried again just weeks later. She loosened the lug nuts on Albert's car, expecting the wheels to fall off during his daily commute and cause a fatal crash. Instead, Albert noticed the car pulling to one side and had the vehicle serviced, where a mechanic discovered and corrected the mechanical failure before any harm occurred. Each failed attempt only strengthened Ruth's resolve. She began discussing her plans openly with Henry during their hotel room rendezvous, drawing him deeper into her web of premeditated murder. Initially horrified by Ruth's coldly calculated schemes, Henry gradually found himself not just accepting, but actively participating in the planning. Ruth had a way of making murder seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. Albert was standing in the way of their happiness, their future, their very right to exist as they chose. Henry's transformation from reluctant accomplice to willing participant didn't happen overnight. Ruth worked on him systematically, exploiting his loneliness, his romantic nature, his desire to be the hero in someone's story. She painted Albert as a monster who mistreated her, who stood between them and true love. She made Henry believe that killing Albert wasn't murder. It was liberation, justice, a heroic rescue of a damsel in distress. The lovers began researching murder methods with the enthusiasm of amateur scientists. They studied newspaper accounts of perfect crimes, analyzed detective stories for inspiration, and discussed various scenarios with the casual tone other couples might use to plan vacation itineraries. Poison seemed too traceable, shooting too obvious, drowning too difficult to arrange convincingly. By the winter of 1926, Ruth had settled on her preferred method. She would drug Albert into unconsciousness, then stage a violent burglary gone wrong. The plan would require Henry's direct participation. Someone had to actually strike the fatal blow while Ruth established her alibi. But Henry's squeamishness about violence remained a significant obstacle. Ruth knew exactly how to overcome his reluctance. She would make him feel like the most important man in the world, the answer to all her prayers, her knight in shining armor. And if love wasn't enough to motivate Henry Judd Gray to commit murder, Ruth had other weapons in her arsenal of persuasion. March 19, 1927. The Snyder house on 222nd Street sat in darkness, its windows reflecting the pale moonlight like dead eyes. Inside, Ruth Snyder was preparing to become a widow. Tonight, after months of planning and failed attempts, Albert Snyder would finally die, or so his wife believed. The evening had begun like any other. Albert returned from work at his usual time, kissed Lorraine goodnight, and settled into his favorite armchair to read the newspaper. Ruth served dinner with unusual attention, ensuring Albert's glass never emptied and his plate remained full. She had laced his whiskey with sleeping powder obtained from Henry, enough to render a man unconscious, but not enough to kill outright. That honor would require more direct methods. Earlier that day, Ruth had driven to Syracuse under the pretense of visiting her mother, but her real destination was a hotel room where Henry Gray waited with trembling hands and a heart full of dread. The plan they'd rehearsed dozens of times suddenly felt impossibly complex. Henry was to take the 7:30 train back to New York, establish his presence at a Syracuse hotel, then secretly return to Queens to help Ruth stage Albert's murder as a botched burglary. By 10:30 p.m., Albert was snoring heavily in his bedroom, the sleeping powder having done its work. Ruth crept through the house like a ghost, removing her jewelry and hiding it in various locations to support the burglary narrative. She loosened several light fixtures, scattered papers across the floor, and even inflicted minor injuries on herself to appear as though she'd struggled with intruders. Henry arrived just after midnight, slipping through the side door Ruth had left unlocked. In the dim hallway light, he looked like a man walking to his own execution, pale, sweating, his usually neat appearance disheveled by anxiety. Ruth had never seen him so frightened, but there was no turning back now. Too much planning, too much hope, too much money waited on the other side of Albert's death. They stood over Albert's unconscious form. This ordinary man whose only crime was loving a dead woman more than his living wife. Ruth handed Henry a weighted sash cord she'd prepared, but his hands shook so violently he could barely hold it. When he tried to loop it around Albert's neck, his nerve failed completely. Albert stirred slightly, mumbling incoherently, and Henry jumped back as though he'd been electrocuted. "I can't do it," Henry whispered, his voice breaking. "Ruth, I can't kill him." Ruth's careful composure finally cracked. Months of planning, weeks of anticipation, and now her lover was failing her at the crucial moment. Without hesitation, she grabbed a weighted window sash weight from her prepared arsenal and brought it down on Albert's skull with sickening force. The sound echoed through the bedroom like a thunderclap, wet, final, horrifying. But Albert Snyder proved harder to kill than his wife had anticipated. Despite the devastating head wound, he began to regain consciousness, blood streaming down his face as he tried to understand what was happening. Ruth struck him again, then again, each blow more frenzied than the last. Henry stood frozen, watching the woman he thought he loved transform into something monstrous. Albert's eyes opened, focusing with terrible clarity on his wife's face. For a moment that would haunt Henry for the rest of his brief life, Albert Snyder understood exactly what was happening to him. He tried to speak, perhaps to plead, perhaps to ask why, but Ruth pressed a pillow over his face, smothering his final words. Even then, Albert fought for life with the stubborn determination that had defined his character. Ruth grabbed the sash cord Henry had abandoned and wrapped it around her husband's throat, pulling with all her strength while Henry watched in paralyzed horror. When Albert's struggles finally ceased, Ruth looked up at her lover with blood-spattered hands and wild eyes. "It's done," she said simply, as though they'd just finished hanging wallpaper rather than committing murder. "Now we can be together forever." But Henry Gray was discovering that murder changes everything. The murderers most of all. The woman he'd fallen in love with was gone, replaced by someone capable of beating her husband to death with methodical brutality. And the worst part was yet to come, making their perfect crime look accidental. The aftermath of murder is never as clean as the movies suggest. Ruth Snyder discovered this truth as she stood in her bedroom at 2:47 a.m., staring at Albert's lifeless body and the shocking amount of blood that had pooled beneath his shattered skull. The simple burglary gone wrong, she'd envisioned, was rapidly becoming a forensic nightmare that would challenge even the most gullible investigators. Henry Gray sat on the edge of the bed, his face buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The gentle corset salesman who had wooed Ruth with poetry and promises was gone, replaced by a broken man who kept repeating, "What have we done? Dear God, what have we done?" Ruth felt no such remorse. Only irritation that her lover was falling apart when she needed him most focused. The house looked like a hurricane had torn through it, but not in the way Ruth had intended. Instead of appearing ransacked by burglars, it looked like the scene of a vicious struggle, which, of course, it was. Albert's blood had splattered across the wallpaper, the bedsheets, even the ceiling. Ruth realized with growing panic that cleaning this mess would be impossible, and leaving it would immediately expose their carefully crafted burglary narrative as a lie. "Pull yourself together," Ruth hissed at Henry, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him like a rag doll. "We have work to finish." They spent the next 2 hours in a desperate attempt to make murder look like burglary. Ruth scattered jewelry boxes around the house while Henry, moving like a sleepwalker, turned over furniture and emptied drawers. But their performance felt hollow, theatrical, like amateur actors trying to stage a play they'd never properly rehearsed. The most crucial element of their plan was Ruth's alibi. She had told Albert she was visiting her mother in the Bronx, and she needed to establish her presence there before discovering the crime. At 4:30 a.m., Ruth drove to her mother's apartment, climbed through a window she'd left unlocked earlier, and slipped into bed still wearing clothes stained with her husband's blood. Henry faced his own alibi challenge. He needed to be back in Syracuse, playing the role of traveling salesman, when Albert's body was discovered. But the train schedule worked against him. The earliest departure wouldn't get him to Syracuse until late morning, leaving a dangerous gap in his timeline. Panic overtook careful planning as Henry realized their perfect crime was already unraveling. At 7:30 a.m., Ruth called the Queens police from her mother's apartment, her voice carefully modulated to convey shock and fear. "Something terrible has happened," she sobbed into the telephone. "I think my husband has been murdered. Please come quickly." Detective Inspector Arthur Carey arrived at the Snyder house to find a crime scene that immediately aroused suspicion. The burglary looked staged, too obvious, too theatrical. Drawers had been emptied, but expensive items left in plain sight. The house showed signs of violence far beyond what any burglar would inflict while searching for valuables. Most tellingly, Albert Snyder lay in his bed rather than on the floor, suggesting he'd been killed where he slept rather than confronting intruders. Ruth's performance upon returning home was Oscar-worthy in its melodrama, but lacking in authentic detail. She threw herself across Albert's body, wailing about her dear, sweet husband, while carefully avoiding the blood that would stain her clothes. She claimed to have been bound and gagged by the intruders, then knocked unconscious, but could provide no explanation for how she'd escaped her bonds or why she showed no physical signs of such treatment beyond a few scratches she'd inflicted on herself. The story Ruth told grew more elaborate and contradictory with each retelling. She described 2 burglars, one tall, one short, who had awakened her in the middle of the night. They'd demanded jewelry and money, beaten Albert when he resisted, then tied her up and left her for dead. But when pressed for details, Ruth's memory became conveniently foggy. She couldn't describe the men's faces, voices, or distinguishing characteristics with any consistency. Detective Carey's skepticism deepened when neighbors reported seeing no suspicious activity during the night, and when Ruth's story about the timeline kept changing. Most damning of all was the physical evidence. The murder weapons, the sash weight and picture wire, had come from inside the house, and fingerprint analysis was about to reveal whose hands had wielded them. Meanwhile, Henry Gray was discovering that guilt leaves its own physical evidence. Hotel clerks in Syracuse would remember the nervous, sweating man who'd checked in at an impossible hour with no luggage and bloodshot eyes that spoke of horrors witnessed rather than a peaceful night's sleep. The perfect murder was becoming the perfect disaster, and the police were just getting started. April 18, 1927. The Queens County Courthouse buzzed with an electricity usually reserved for prize fights or Broadway premieres. Outside, vendors hawked peanuts and newspapers while hundreds of spectators pressed against police barricades, desperate for a glimpse of the most notorious murderess in American history. Inside, Ruth Snyder sat at the defendant's table, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her blue eyes scanning the packed courtroom with the calculating gaze of a woman who still believed she could charm her way out of the electric chair. The arrest had come swiftly once Detective Inspector Arthur Carey began pulling at the loose threads of Ruth's fabricated story. Henry Gray had crumbled under questioning within hours, his confessions spilling out like water from a broken dam. He told police everything: the affair, the insurance policies, the failed murder attempts, and finally the brutal details of that March night when Albert Snyder died at his wife's hands. Ruth's reaction to Henry's betrayal was pure fury disguised as wounded innocence. She painted herself as the victim of a manipulative older man who had seduced her, corrupted her, and ultimately forced her to participate in murder against her will. Henry, she claimed, was the mastermind who had threatened to kill both her and Lorraine if she didn't cooperate. It was a masterful performance that might have worked if the physical evidence hadn't told such a different story. District Attorney Richard Newcomb approached this case like a military campaign, assembling an overwhelming arsenal of evidence against the defendants. The murder weapons had been found hidden in the Snyder house, bearing Ruth's fingerprints. The sleeping powder discovered in Albert's system matched tablets found in Henry's possession. Most damning of all were the love letters. Hundreds of passionate exchanges between the lovers that detailed their affair, their murder plans, and Ruth's obsession with Albert's insurance money. "Dearest Henry," one letter read aloud in court, "I can't stand this much longer. Albert suspects nothing, and the insurance papers are all in order. We could be so happy together if only he were gone." The courtroom gasped as Prosecutor Newcomb read passage after incriminating passage, each one driving another nail into Ruth's legal coffin. The trial became a national obsession, covered by every major newspaper and radio station in America. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a morality play about the dangers of female liberation, the breakdown of traditional marriage, and the corrupting influence of modern urban life. Ruth Snyder embodied every fear conservative America held about the new woman of the 1920s, sexually liberated, financially independent, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of her desires. The press coverage was merciless in its misogyny. Newspapers described Ruth as a blonde tigress, a cold-blooded killer, and a modern Jezebel who had destroyed two families in her lust for money and passion. Editorial writers used her case to argue against women's suffrage, against divorce law reform, against any expansion of female independence. Ruth Snyder became a symbol of everything wrong with modern America. Henry Gray's defense strategy was to paint him as Ruth's hapless victim, a weak man seduced and manipulated by a femme fatale who had used her sexuality to drive him to murder. His lawyer portrayed Henry as fundamentally decent, a devoted father led astray by an evil woman's wiles. The strategy was both cowardly and effective. While it threw Ruth completely under the bus, it offered Henry a slim chance of avoiding the electric chair. Ruth's defense proved far more challenging. Her lawyers attempted to argue temporary insanity, claiming that Albert's emotional abuse and Henry's manipulation had driven their client to a mental breakdown. They painted Ruth as a battered wife driven to desperate measures by an impossible situation. But this narrative collapsed under cross-examination when prosecutors revealed Ruth's methodical planning, her multiple murder attempts, and her cold calculation of insurance payouts. The most explosive moment came when Ruth took the witness stand in her own defense. Dressed in black silk and speaking in carefully modulated tones, she denied being the mastermind behind Albert's murder. Instead, she claimed Henry had forced her participation through threats and violence, painting herself as another victim of the crime rather than its architect. "I loved my husband," Ruth testified, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I would never have hurt him if Mr. Gray hadn't forced me to. He said he would kill me and my little daughter if I didn't help him. But under Prosecutor Newcomb's ruthless cross-examination, Ruth's story began to unravel. How did she explain the insurance policies she'd researched so thoroughly? What about the love letters expressing her hatred for Albert? Why had she struck the fatal blows if Henry was controlling the crime? With each question, Ruth's credibility crumbled, her performance revealing itself as exactly that, a desperate act by a woman who had finally run out of lies. May 9, 1927. The jury had been deliberating for nearly 6 hours, their voices a muted rumble behind the heavy oak doors of the deliberation room. Outside, Ruth Snyder sat ramrod straight at the defendant's table, her manicured fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the polished wood. For the first time since her arrest, cracks were beginning to show in her carefully maintained composure. The woman who had once believed she could manipulate any man now faced 12 men whose judgment would determine whether she lived or died. Henry Gray slumped in his chair like a broken marionette, his face gray with exhaustion and terror. The gentle corset salesman who had once wooed Ruth with poetry and promises was now a hollow shell of a man, destroyed by the weight of his confession and the knowledge that his former lover had painted him as the architect of their crime. Throughout the trial, he had watched Ruth perform for the cameras, spinning tales of coercion and victimhood that transformed their passionate affair into a story of predator and prey. The courtroom itself had become a theater of American justice, packed to capacity with spectators who treated the proceedings like entertainment. Society matrons rubbed shoulders with factory workers, all united in their fascination with the blonde murderess who had shattered the facade of suburban respectability. The press section overflowed with reporters from every major newspaper in the country, their typewriter keys clicking like machine guns as they documented every gesture, every expression, every hint of emotion from the defendants. Judge Townsend Scudder maintained iron control over his courtroom, but even he could not suppress the electric tension that filled the air as the jury's deliberations stretched into the evening hours. This was more than a murder trial. It was a referendum on modern morality, on the changing role of women in American society, on the very nature of justice itself. The 12 men behind those doors held the power to send a woman to the electric chair, a prospect that both thrilled and horrified the watching nation. The evidence against Ruth had been overwhelming. Prosecutor Newcomb had methodically destroyed her claims of innocence, revealing her as the calculating mastermind behind Albert's murder. The love letters alone would have been enough to convict her. Passionate exchanges that detailed her hatred for her husband and her obsession with his insurance money. Add to that the physical evidence, Henry's confession, and Ruth's own contradictory testimony, and the case seemed ironclad. But Ruth's gender complicated everything. American juries had historically shown reluctance to sentence women to death, particularly attractive women who could evoke sympathy and maternal instincts. Ruth's lawyers had counted on this chivalrous impulse, portraying their client as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. They painted Albert as an emotionally abusive husband and Henry as a manipulative predator who had exploited Ruth's vulnerability for his own twisted purposes. At 9:47 p.m., the jury foreman knocked on the deliberation room door. The bailiff's cry of "All rise" sent a shiver through the packed courtroom as Judge Scudder took his place behind the bench. Ruth stood slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mask of forced calm. Henry rose beside her, swaying slightly as though he might collapse at any moment. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Scudder asked. "We have, Your Honor," replied Foreman Edward J. Moran, a middle-aged banker whose voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The courtroom fell silent as death itself. Even the ever-present clicking of newspaper cameras ceased as reporters leaned forward in their seats. This was the moment America had been waiting for, the climactic scene in the trial that had captivated a nation. On the charge of murder in the first degree against Ruth Brown Snyder, how do you find? Guilty. The single word hit Ruth like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure finally shattered as she gripped the defendant's table to keep from falling. A collective gasp rose from the gallery, followed by a buzz of excited conversation that Judge Scudder immediately silenced with his gavel. On the charge of murder in the first degree against Henry Judd Gray, how do you find? Guilty. Henry Gray made no sound, showed no reaction. He had expected this verdict, had perhaps even welcomed it as an end to the torment that had consumed him since that terrible night in March. But Ruth was not finished fighting. Even as the bailiff moved to escort her from the courtroom, she turned to the jury with eyes blazing with fury and desperation. "You're making a terrible mistake," she cried out, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'm innocent. Henry Gray forced me to do everything. I never wanted to hurt Albert." But her protests fell on deaf ears. The jury had spoken, America had its verdict, and Ruth Snyder's fate was sealed. The death house at Sing Sing prison crouched along the Hudson River like a concrete beast, its windows barred against both escape and hope. On January 11th, 1928, Ruth Snyder sat in cell number 9, less than 24 hours from her appointment with the electric chair. She had spent 8 months in this 10 by 6 foot concrete tomb, watching the seasons change through her narrow window while lawyers filed appeals that were systematically denied by higher courts. Ruth had aged dramatically during her imprisonment. The platinum blonde hair that had once been her trademark now showed dark roots. Her carefully maintained figure had grown gaunt from prison food and stress, and her steel blue eyes held a haunted quality that no amount of makeup could disguise. But even facing death, Ruth Snyder refused to abandon the performance that had defined her adult life. She maintained her innocence with religious fervor, insisting to anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a massive conspiracy. 2 cells away, Henry Judd Gray had transformed into a broken shell of his former self. The gentle man who had once sold corsets to polite society ladies now spent his days reading scripture and writing letters to his daughter Jane. Letters the prison censors would never allow her to read. Henry's confession had earned him no mercy from the courts, but it had at least provided him with a measure of peace. He had told the truth, accepted responsibility for his actions, and found a kind of redemption in his acknowledgement of guilt. The contrast between the 2 condemned prisoners could not have been more stark. Ruth raged against her fate, filing appeal after appeal, granting interviews to reporters who hung on her every word. She had become a celebrity in her own right, receiving hundreds of letters from admirers and marriage proposals from men who found her notoriety irresistible. She posed for photographers, gave exclusive interviews, and even attempted to sell her life story to Hollywood producers. Henry, by contrast, had retreated into himself, refusing most interviews and spending his final months in quiet contemplation. He had found religion in his cell, not the desperate conversion of a man seeking last-minute salvation, but the genuine faith of someone who had finally confronted the enormity of his sins. Prison guards described him as the most cooperative inmate on death row, a man who had accepted his punishment with grace and dignity. The execution was scheduled for 11 p.m. on January 12, 1928. Both prisoners would die the same night, in the same electric chair, their bodies claimed by the same justice system they had tried so desperately to evade. The state of New York had never before executed a woman, making Ruth's impending death a historic event that attracted international attention. On her final day, Ruth received her last meal, a simple affair of chicken, mashed potatoes, and vanilla ice cream that she barely touched. She spent hours with her spiritual advisor, Father John McCaffrey, though witnesses noted her attention seemed focused more on her appearance than her soul. Even facing death, Ruth obsessed over how she would look in the electric chair, requesting that her hair be styled and her dress pressed for the cameras she knew would be present. Henry's final day was markedly different. He ate his last meal in silence, spent hours in prayer, and wrote final letters to his wife Isabel and daughter Jane, letters filled with remorse and asking for their forgiveness. Unlike Ruth, who continued to proclaim her innocence, Henry used his final hours to accept full responsibility for his crimes and to seek whatever redemption might still be possible. As evening approached, the death house filled with official witnesses, reporters, prison officials, state representatives, and the warden himself. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky by inmates, had been tested multiple times throughout the day to ensure it would function properly. The executioner, Robert Elliott, made his final preparations with the methodical precision of a man who had presided over dozens of such ceremonies. At 10:30 p.m., Father McCaffrey administered last rites to both prisoners. Ruth continued to maintain her innocence even in these final moments. telling the priest that she forgave Henry for destroying her life with his lies. Henry, when his turn came, made no such protestations. He simply asked God's forgiveness and expressed hope that his death might somehow bring peace to Albert Snyder's family. The walk from the holding cells to the execution chamber was only 30 feet, but for Ruth Snyder, it represented the final steps of a journey that had begun with a chance meeting in a Manhattan restaurant and ended in the death house of America's most notorious prison. 11:06 p.m., January 12, 1928. Sing Sing Prison's execution chamber hummed with barely contained electricity, both literal and metaphorical. Ruth Snyder, flanked by two matrons, stepped through the heavy steel door into a room that would become her tomb. The witnesses sat in tiered rows like theater patrons, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and professional detachment. Among them, concealed beneath his pressed trousers, Chicago Tribune photographer Tom Howard carried a camera that would capture the most controversial image in American journalism history. Ruth wore a simple brown dress, her hair pinned back in a modest bun that revealed the pale curve of her neck where the electrodes would make contact. At 33, she walked with the same calculated grace that had once captivated Henry Gray and fooled countless observers into believing her innocent. Even facing death, Ruth Snyder was performing, her chin raised defiantly as she surveyed the crowd that had gathered to watch her die. "Any last words?" asked Warden Lewis Laws, his voice barely audible above the electrical hum of the chair. Ruth's voice rang clear in the chamber, carrying no trace of fear or remorse. "I am innocent. I am paying for the sins of others. May God forgive them." Her eyes swept across the witnesses, settling for a moment on the reporters who had chronicled her fall from suburban housewife to America's most notorious female criminal. She was giving them one final performance, one last glimpse of the woman who had refused to break even under the weight of overwhelming evidence. The guards strapped Ruth into the heavy oak chair with practiced efficiency. Leather restraints circled her wrists, ankles, and chest. A metal cap containing electrodes was placed on her shaved head, while another electrode pressed against her leg. Ruth's breathing remained steady, controlled, as though she were preparing for a photo shoot rather than execution. The transformation was complete. The passionate woman who had murdered for love and money had become a cold, defiant figure who would die as she had lived, convinced of her own invincibility. What Ruth didn't know, what no one in that chamber except Tom Howard knew, was that history was watching through the lens of a hidden camera. Howard had spent weeks planning this moment, studying the layout of the execution chamber, timing the guards' movements, calculating angles, and lighting conditions. The camera strapped to his ankle represented more than journalistic ambition. It embodied America's insatiable hunger for spectacle, for the ultimate reality of death transformed into entertainment. At exactly 11:06 p.m., executioner Robert Elliott threw the switch. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ruth Snyder's body, her frame rigid against the leather straps as current coursed through her nervous system. For 17 seconds, she became something beyond human, a conduit for the state's vengeance, a symbol of justice delivered with mechanical precision. In that moment, as Ruth's life ended, Tom Howard pressed the shutter release hidden in his palm. The camera's flash illuminated the execution chamber for a split second, capturing not just a woman's death, but the dark soul of a nation transfixed by violence. The photograph would show Ruth slumped in the chair, her body still twitching from the electrical current, her face hidden by the leather death mask, but her humanity somehow still visible in the graceful curve of her hands. Henry Gray followed Ruth to the chair 20 minutes later, his execution a mere footnote to the main event. He walked to his death with quiet dignity, offering a final apology to Albert Snyder's memory and asking God's forgiveness for his crimes. Unlike Ruth, Henry had found peace in accepting responsibility for his actions. His death was swift, unmarked by the theatrical drama that had characterized every aspect of Ruth's final performance. But it was Ruth's photograph that would change everything. When the New York Daily News published Howard's image on their front page the next morning, it sold over 1.5 million copies, a circulation record that would stand for decades. The photograph was simultaneously horrifying and mesmerizing, offering America its first glimpse into the ultimate consequence of criminal justice. Readers couldn't look away from the image of Ruth Snyder's lifeless form, her final performance captured for eternity. The photograph sparked a national debate about the death penalty, press ethics, and the boundaries of public decency. Religious leaders condemned the image as ghoulish exploitation, while others praised it as a powerful deterrent to potential criminals. The debate raged in editorial pages, pulpits, and living rooms across America, but one thing was undeniable. Tom Howard's photograph had transformed execution from private punishment into public spectacle. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. Ruth Snyder had sought fame and found it, though not in the way she had imagined. Her photograph became an icon of American justice, a haunting reminder that even the most carefully planned crimes eventually face their reckoning. The image would outlive everyone who witnessed her execution, becoming a permanent part of America's criminal mythology, proof that in the end, the camera captures not just what we do, but who we truly are.